Please welcome Eamonn O'Brien.
Going through Dublin Airport recently, I had just passed the security gates, and the next thing I hear on the other side of the gates, "Oh man!" And I look over and I see this really red-faced tourist with a big old Ohio University t-shirt, and he's livid. And I can see why instantly, because there beside him, the security guard with a bottle of whiskey. Good stuff, Irish whiskey. In fact, it was Bushmills. And for any of the whiskey drinkers who are in here, it's obscenely expensive stuff because it was 21-year-old whiskey, which I gather is over $200 a bottle. The fellow to the left of me, who's watching all this, thinks it's hilarious. A second later, another security guard, "I'll take care of that," takes the bottle, and he's gone by all the other security gates, and I look at the fella to the side of me and I said, "Oh yeah, he's going to take care of that all right." And this fella said, "I suppose that in Ireland this is what you call a wink-wink moment, no? I think tonight they'll have a party." It was a wink-wink moment, and the other security guard did not make things better when he pointed by the security gates towards the duty-free and he said, "Don't worry, you can buy more over there." Here's the thing. I have no idea how long that fellow was in Ireland. It could have been days, it could have been weeks. He probably had the best time. And yet, when he thinks back to the time that he was in Ireland, what will one of his most abiding memories be? The day he lost that bottle of whiskey. That story is going to be told. But he will remember that for all of the wrong reasons. In the next few minutes, I want to share with you 3 things that you can do that would help people to remember your stories for the right reason. To begin with, as I was telling you that story about that fellow and the other guy, and the other guy who was wandering around party on, bud, could you see him? You see, here's the thing. If you found that story interesting, you probably invested in it, and you started to think, what's going to happen next? Could it get any worse? Actually, you know it could. And something else happened, and this is critically important. As you were thinking what's going to happen next, you likely also thought, what would I do in that situation? In other words, it was visceral. It made you feel. And that feeling is unbelievably important because that's what causes you to remember a story. And incidentally, when it comes to stories, if you're not using stories to share your messages, you should, because fully 70% of anything that you will learn in life comes from the stories that you tell, the stories that you share, the stories that you believe. But first of all, it's got to be visceral. The second thing is, how do you choose a story that you're going to use? Well, truth is that it needs to be interesting not just to the audience, but to you. And the stories that will be most of interest to you, actually they tend to be personal stories. Why? Because you're in them. And the thing about telling personal stories is 2 things will be true. Firstly, you won't be compared with anybody else because it's yours. And the second thing is, because you know exactly what happened, you can put lots of vim and vigor and passion into that story. But if you're sitting there thinking, "Oh, I don't know if I have many stories. I don't know much of a storyteller." Firstly, that's not true. A lot of people who don't tell stories, they feel, I don't know if the stories I have are any good, if they're big enough. They're like, there I was at the top of Mount Everest and the wind was flying at 90 miles an hour and I said, to hell with it, I'm putting my flag in. Listen, if you have one of those stories, congratulations. If you have 2 of those stories, that is fantastic. If you have 3 or more, frankly, you're quite unusual. Truth is, most of the stories that you and your audiences relate to are much smaller, like my pal with a bottle of whiskey, and I promise he will never forget his day in Dublin Airport. But how do you get at those stories? Well, here is your secret weapon, ladies and gentlemen. You should have this with you at all times, in your pocket or in your bag. Be a collector of stories. You will astound yourself how quickly you can collect a plethora of stories. And the first thing you should do is start with all the stuff you know already. My father did not have many catchphrases, but he did have one. He would always say to us before going out to a dance, "Now you're to dance with the girl you brought." That's what I want you to do when it comes to stories. Start with what you know already. That's you're off to a flying start. But be a collector of stories. And sometimes the stories will be quite raw. And I'm going to give you an example of a raw story, which I have not decided yet how to use this yet. But let me just give you a quick illustration. So last month, I was flying from Edinburgh to London early morning with another speaker called Stefan, and we were absolutely looking for a cup of coffee. But the cafe was absolutely full of people. But Stefan says, "Don't worry, we're only little, I'll find a space. You get the coffee." So I go off, get the coffees. And there's Stefan, and he's found this little space that he's got into, and the table is full of stuff. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do with this? And there's 2 kindly ladies there, and they're looking at me. And one says, "Oh, don't worry about that." And they just picked up the stuff. Oh. And then it plonked on somebody else's table. And then the other woman looked at me and says, "We may be old, but we're nae innocent." And I love that, because it was basically like 2 75-year-olds who were like 2 7.5-year-olds going. Now, I haven't decided how I might use that story, but you can see how easily I might use that to talk about not judging a book by its cover. So stories that are interesting to you. But it's the third thing, and it's a critical ingredient, and you need this or else your story doesn't work. You must have a problem that your audiences will likely care about. Remember this: no problem, no story. But if you have those 3 things, where it is visceral, it makes you feel something, where it is interesting to you personally, where it is something that will absolutely cause the audience to care about, to invest in what's going to happen. That is visceral, interesting, problem, VIP. That's a special story. And you will likely have people remember it, not for weeks, not for months, but possibly for years. Thank you.